Today we're going to begin by finishing up our discussion of the topic of succession. And after I say a few more words about that, we're going to move on to our last topic under the heading of the living world, which is biogeochemical cycles. By this term I mean cycles of materials that are critical for life processes, how it is that these things cycle through the geological environment and also the living environment. For now, let's consider this view in front of us here. This is of a recent lava flow on the island of Hawaii. Notice that in the background there is this area of forest. The forest occurs on an ancient cinder cone, which was above the lava flow, but everything in the path of the lava was destroyed by this. Now let's take a look at a picture of a similar location, but a little later on in time. What you see here is another area of lava flow, a recent lava flow in the background where it's all black, but in the foreground a lava flow that occurred some years before. Now, in this case, the lava flow has been colonized by herbaceous plants and even some shrubby plants. So, how might we describe this? Is this an area of primary succession or an area of secondary succession? The area was once vegetated, but on the other hand, it was completely sterilized by the super hot lava flows that moved over this area, leaving a bare mineral environment. So it's a question which is open to some interpretation, what you care to call it, whether you care to call it one or the other of these things. But however you wish to define it, what has happened here is that succession was set back by a catastrophic event. Volcanic activity is like that, and I suppose we could probably think of some other catastrophic geological processes that might set back succession to a much earlier stage as well. Think in terms of earthquakes, for example, tidal waves. So we have here an area that was set back all the way to the beginning, to this bare environment that organisms then had to start colonizing and modifying, again in a rather orderly kind of a fashion, with first herbaceous plants colonizing, followed by pioneer woody plants, and ultimately again forest trees would come to invade an area like this. Here we have another similar kind of an example, the island of Anatahan, which we've visited in several previous programs. We see on the left a photograph of the crater of this volcano in the tropical Pacific before it erupted, and then another view from a satellite showing it after it erupted, turning it into a sterilized environment by the superheated lava flow and volcanic activity, bringing it all the way back to the beginning where succession has to start all over again. Now I have one last topic to discuss under this general heading of succession. Let's look at this tree here. Actually, there's a grouping of trees here. These are black spruces as they are growing in the state of Connecticut. Now, Connecticut is at the extreme southern range limit of this species, which is primarily a boreal inhabitant, and yet there are isolated populations that occur in wetlands across especially northern and northwestern Connecticut, in cooler locations. They are a throwback to an earlier time when Connecticut was a much colder place not long after the last ice age. So if we go back 8,000 years, black spruce and its relatives would have been the predominant trees here. But time has gone on, climates have changed, and species and communities have altered with that change. And so we can talk of black spruce as being a relic of an earlier time. So here's my point. When one looks at ecological systems historically over long periods of times, we see that communities, ecosystems, even biomes, however you want to define them, these are entities that change. They come and go, and they rearrange themselves even. So as Earth's climate has changed, the kinds of communities found in any particular geographic location have changed. So communities that we see today were not always present. In fact, there is evidence from prehistoric deposits of pollen that there were once communities present that have no counterpart today, even in similar physical environments. So there were associations of species that once occurred, and those species still exist, but they no longer occur in the same kinds of associations. So the more one finds out about nature, and the longer one's perspective, the more curious and difficult to explain things become. So now let's turn our attention to these biogeochemical cycles. We've already looked at one, the hydrologic cycle, how it is that water cycles through ecosystems, but there are still several others that I want to focus on. There's a number that we could talk about, actually. We could talk about the sulfur cycle and a whole bunch of other kinds of elements and how it is that they are processed through living systems and the physical environment, but I'm going to focus on three: the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Nitrogen and phosphorus are two of the principal macronutrients of plants, two of the things that make plants grow. The third one, potassium, we could also talk about, but let's limit our discussion to these. And of course, living things on Earth are all carbon-based, so we need to talk about that one too. One thing that we could say about oxygen is something that you should already know and that we've even talked about a bit in this series, and that is that the fact that oxygen exists in our atmosphere is to a significant degree a consequence of life processes. It is the waste product of photosynthesis. And as this oxygen accumulated in our atmosphere, it presented the opportunity for a revolution in life on Earth. It presented the opportunity for aerobic respiration to develop, which is a much higher energy kind of a process, if you recall, than its predecessor, anaerobic respiration. One can generate much more energy for life processes using oxygen as a means of carrying on respiration. But this is all stuff that you should have learned about in introductory biology, so I'm not going to go into the details of all that again here. So let's begin by talking about the carbon cycle. This is an image that was developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it does a pretty good job of illustrating some of the flow of carbon through our biosphere. We find carbon dioxide in our atmosphere in small amounts, and it gets into the atmosphere by several different mechanisms. A physical mechanism would be volcanic activity releases carbon dioxide from deep in the earth. as part of the volcanic gases. Carbon dioxide is also released into the atmosphere by living processes, cellular respiration, the waste product of which is carbon dioxide. So plants produce carbon dioxide as they carry on respiration. Animals do, even bacteria do. So all these life processes involving respiration all generate carbon dioxide, which enters the atmosphere. Another thing that living organisms do, notably us, is to burn fossil fuels. So engaging in processes that take carbon that had previously been stored in the Earth's crust and releasing it back into the atmosphere by burning it. A natural process which is a bit like that would be fires. Now, forest fires or grassland fires, fires anywhere on the planet, as they burn living material, as they burn plant material primarily, the product of that combustion is also carbon dioxide. So all those things are routes for carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere. So that's part of the cycle. But then we also have carbon dioxide being extracted from the atmosphere. And of course, that's one of the things that plants do, is during the process of photosynthesis, they're using carbon dioxide to manufacture carbohydrates, among other things. And so they are extracting it and sequestering it, incorporating it, in other words, into their living tissue. And then, of course, as animals eat the plants, that carbon is transferred from the plants to the animals. Now, ultimately, plants and animals are going to die, and some of the carbon in their tissues can be released into the atmosphere by the action of decomposers. Although not all of it necessarily winds up that way. Lots of organic materials can get stored. In fact, that's what coal and oil deposits are, is living organisms from a long time ago, from Carboniferous times, which had their carbon-bearing tissues stored in the Earth's surface, where those carbon-bearing materials remained for hundreds of millions of years until people started extracting them and using them. Now, that's still not everything that there is to say about the carbon cycle, however. We also have to consider that big blue thing in the middle of this image, the ocean. The ocean is a huge reservoir for carbon, in that carbon dioxide dissolves in water. And water, in fact, has a substantial capacity for accepting carbon dioxide and dissolving it into itself. And so the ocean also serves as a huge carbon reservoir. And in fact, when researchers have been studying global warming, one of the things that they have discovered is the extent to which the presence of the ocean has buffered us from the full effects of the amount of carbon we've put into the atmosphere. The ocean has absorbed enormous amounts of that, although ultimately it can't absorb it continuously. At some point, it also reaches saturation. Now, with respect to the ocean also, we have to realize that there's a lot of organisms that live in the ocean. Photosynthetic organisms and also heterotrophic organisms, various kinds of animals, etc. And all these organisms, as they grow and develop also accumulate carbon in their tissues. And this carbon can also be stored in the sediments in the ocean as organic deposits. Now here's another interesting graphic from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This one looks at anthropogenic aspects of the carbon cycle. In other words, human influenced aspects. So the numbers that you see in red are human inputs into the system, into the atmosphere, and also from the atmosphere back into the rest of the ecosystem. The numbers are in gigatons of carbon, and the rates at which this is happening are in gigatons of carbon per year. So those arrows with the numbers refer to gigatons going into the atmosphere and coming out of the atmosphere and all that sort of thing. The black numbers, in contrast, refer to natural processes in the absence of human activity. So let's summarize. Carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere by phenomena like respiration, decomposition, combustion of organic materials, and it can be removed from the atmosphere by things like photosynthesis, as well as storage in the ocean by dissolving in seawater. Although there is another phenomenon that I haven't mentioned, and that is something that goes on in tropical oceans. The formation of coral reefs also removes carbon from the atmosphere by using it to manufacture calcium carbonate, the stuff that coral reefs are made of. So let's move on to the next cycle, the nitrogen cycle. You may recall that most of our atmosphere is actually composed of nitrogen, but you may not have also realized just how important nitrogen is as a component of biomolecules. Think back to introductory biology and what you know about proteins and amino acids and things like that. Those are all nitrogen-bearing compounds. So much of life processes are dependent not only on carbon, but also on nitrogen. So it's another substance that it's worth spending some time talking about. Atmosphere is this huge reservoir, and then from the atmosphere, it makes it into living systems by a rather complex series of events that involve certain kinds of bacteria. So let's look through this image here and see what happens. Let's start in the upper left. From the atmosphere, nitrogen is taken out by a group of bacteria referred to as the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They can actually use elemental nitrogen and turn it into an organic form. What they do is they turn it into ammonia compounds, ammonium ions. And these in turn can be acted upon by other kinds of bacteria referred to as nitrifying bacteria, which take those ammoniums and convert them in a series of steps from nitrites to nitrates. And nitrates particularly are nutrients for plants, and so plants assimilate them. Now, there are other routes, however, to get to some of these pathways. Look at the frog and those leaves there. Okay, these are plants and animals don't live forever. Eventually they die, and when they die, they are acted upon by decomposers. And one of the products of decomposition is ammonia. If you've ever gone into a hen house, like I do every day, and if the hen house has not been cleaned lately, you can smell the ammonium ions from the manure of the chickens. So it's not just animals and plants dying and decaying, but it's also the waste products of those animals that are acted upon to produce ammonia. And so this then can also enter the cycle where they can be acted upon by nitrifying bacteria. There is still one other group of bacteria, however, referred to as denitrifying bacteria, the ones that break down things like nitrates and return nitrogen back to the atmosphere, completing, therefore, the cycle. So there are a series of terms now that I need to review. Let's look at the first one, nitrogen fixation. This is that process that goes on with certain kinds of bacteria, often which work in concert with the roots of certain kinds of plants, especially pea plants and pea relatives. They have what are referred to as root nodules, and in these nodules there are colonies of bacteria. Pea plants, by the way, are in the legume family, so they're often referred to as leguminous plants. The Fabaceae is the actual name of the plant family. So these take in atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into those ammonium compounds. And these ammonium compounds then are acted upon through the process of nitrification. So bacteria, different class of bacteria, convert the ammonium to nitrates and nitrites. From there, plants can assimilate these materials. So the roots actually can absorb the nitrates and nitrites, and also even some of those ammonium compounds can be directly absorbed by plants. And these are the raw materials from which plants are making organic compounds like proteins. Now, as I said, also decomposition plays a role in this because bacteria break down dead plant remains and also waste products of animals, and as they do that, as these bacteria break these things down, they are again releasing ammonium compounds that can enter into that nitrification cycle. And then the last step, the return of nitrogen to the atmosphere, is accomplished by denitrifying bacteria. So all those terms there that are bulleted are terms that are important for you to know about and be clear on. Now, if you thought that the nitrogen cycle was rather complex, let us now descend into the phosphorus cycle, which, by the looks of this diagram here, is even more complex. However, it is essential that we also talk about phosphorus, because phosphorus, like nitrogen and carbon, is a key component of living things. Think, for example, of the structure of ATP. Think about nucleic acids. Think also in terms of certain classes of lipids. There's one class of lipids called the phospholipids, which are critical components of living systems. So, very important element in life processes. In plants, it is also referred to as one of the macronutrients, one of the big three: nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus are the big three elements that fuel plant growth. So understanding something about the phosphorus cycle is key. So let's focus first on the blue components here, the inputs. There is an atmospheric input from particulates in the atmosphere. There's also a phosphorus-bearing gas that exists in low concentrations in the atmosphere. But generally speaking, the atmospheric contribution to the phosphorus cycle is minimal. The vast majority of phosphorus cycling occurs between living organisms and soil and minerals. And in fact, minerals are the ultimate source for most of input into the phosphorus cycle, as minerals in soil or minerals in rocks, as these things break down, they release phosphorus, which can then become part of phosphorus-bearing compounds like phosphates. Often phosphorus will join with oxygens to form a phosphate ion, PO4. One other kind of input would be a human-related input, fertilizer. And fertilizer can be mined from mineral sources, but it can also be produced from organic sources. Animal manures, particularly things like bird manure, chicken manure, are rather high in phosphorus. In fact, one of the reasons why I raise chickens is because of the phosphorus from their manure that I can then apply to my vegetables. So I can have a organic source of fertilizer rather than a mineral source. So those are the inputs. And now if we turn our attention to the red arrows, we see the outputs. A minor component of output would be leaching out of the system. As water percolates through the soil, it can leach some phosphates out. Although more typically, water will simply make phosphates run off from one place and move to another place. One thing that can happen is phosphates in the soil, in the presence of water percolating through the soil, can wind up in lakes and streams, where they can act like fertilizer in these systems and cause problems, leading to algal blooms and things like that we'll be talking about more later in the year. One other source of output would be another human one, harvest of plants. Okay? Plant tissues contain phosphorus, and so when we harvest agricultural crops, we are removing phosphorus from the system. Now there's a lot of other stuff going on, however, that we need to talk about. Let's look at those pink bubbles. Once phosphorus enters living systems, it gets converted to organic compounds like we were talking about. Things like ATP and phospholipids, nucleic acids, again, those kinds of things all have significant phosphorus components. And those can be broken down and returned to the soil as phosphates, or phosphates can also be used to manufacture these organic phosphorus compounds through processes which we can call immobilization and mineralization. Now, once we have phosphates available in the soil, it also can travel on several other pathways. It can become attached to soil particles, and from those soil particles it can then be used by plants that come in contact with those soil particles. So the process of phosphates becoming attached to soil particles is referred to as adsorption. But they can also be lost and become free phosphates through the process of desorption. Phosphates can also develop into secondary kinds of compounds that can exist in soil. So it's kind of a complex and messy cycle. But these are the pathways that are available for phosphorus to move through the system. And once again, Most of the cycling occurs between living organisms and mineral components like soil and rocks. So let's summarize and expand a bit. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that phosphorus is often a limiting nutrient in systems. It is often the one that is in limited supply, so it has the ultimate effect of controlling how much plant growth can occur. Phosphorus in living systems often exists as phosphate ions, as I pointed out, and much of the phosphorus in living systems ultimately comes from weathering of rocks, especially the mineral apatite. It tends to move rather quickly through living systems, but rather slowly through the physical environment. There is a limited atmospheric component to the phosphorus cycle. Pretty much everything that happens in the soil and in living organisms. Now, one other thing that can happen in the soil is that phosphorus can form rather stable compounds. And when it does so, that also can limit its availability to organisms. And so with that, we have come to the close of our topic of the living world. And we will begin next time by discussing the topic of populations.